Today, I'm speaking with Hilary Lawson, philosopher, award-winning broadcaster, and the founder of the How the Light Gets In Philosophy and Music Festival, which aims to, as it's put, take philosophy out of the academy and back into people's lives. Welcome, Hilary. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
And I am too. Good to see you soon.
Absolutely. Great. So How the Light Gets In has now been going on since 2010. That was the first festival back in Hay. And each year you have a different theme for the festival. This year's theme is Era and Renaissance. Can you just say a bit about what prompted that theme for this year?
Yeah, we always try and tie it in with what's going on in some sort of more global sense. And I guess there were a couple of political events that had occurred in the previous 6 months, which certainly some would see as an era. One was with Afghanistan, but more critically with the Ukraine and the West's misunderstanding, really, of what was going on with Russia and so forth. And then that raised all sorts of questions about our perception of the West and how we were to understand ourselves and so forth. And so, in fact, the initiation of the theme was really driven by geopolitics rather than by a predominantly philosophical theme, although it does have, of course, philosophy at the heart of it. And the idea is that we would try and identify things where we have either been thought to have made an error, or that there are some people who would claim that we have made an error, and what should we do about it, and what possible future alternative might there be. And so we have applied that to all of the different areas that we handle, from science to
the different strands of the debate.
Health. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Are there any sort of specific examples talking about rebirth and correcting these errors? Are there any areas where you see some fruit coming out of this, maybe in the geopolitics or in other debates?
Well, I think we try to do that in absolutely every debate we put forward. Really, we're always looking to see what might be what might be a step forward in each area. So I don't think it's quite difficult to give an overall version of that. We could talk about individual ones, but I think
you give an example maybe.
We do quite a lot in the science area, of course, and we look to areas that might be thought of as an error, and which we don't traditionally think of being errors. So the story about the Big Bang and the immediate period after the Big Bang, which is the center of contemporary physics, is something that we look at in one debate, which is about really the issue of inflation. Now, cosmic inflation is the notion that after the Big Bang, the universe expands at an enormous rate. And it's a requirement of the Big Bang theory that this happens, because otherwise the universe is much bigger than it should be based on the calculations of the initial stages of the universe. So inflation, cosmic inflation is proposed. But most people don't realize that cosmic inflation involves the universe expanding at many times the speed of light. In fact, orders of magnitude faster than the speed of light. And we have a debate which is about questioning whether this is a plausible claim, and should we be doing something about it? Should we see it differently? Is the very story, the overall story of the Big Bang and the origin of the universe, in some way flawed? And should we be thinking of it in a different sort of way altogether? And there are plenty of people who think there are alternatives to that, which take account not just of cosmic inflation, say that's a mistake, but to paint a different picture altogether of how we might understand the origin of the universe. But that would be an example of, we take something where we assume that we know what's going on, we identify possible errors or mistakes that we have overlooked or covered up, which we do all the time, frankly, in various areas of our understanding, and then look to see, well, what could we do about this? How else might we think about the issue?
Right. Great. Yeah. So I think, I mean, the fact that you have such a wealth of different debates on so many different subjects, what we might consider science, politics, the arts, etc., and then what would normally get considered as in the field of philosophy, what prompts a thought about what exactly you mean by philosophy. Do you have this broad sense of in all of these different names you're doing philosophy, or how do you see it?
Yes. So I mean, there obviously is a question. What is philosophy?
What is philosophy? Yeah.
Philosophers are always good at looking at their own navel, and what does philosophy consist of? I simply take it to be our big accounts of the world, our big theories, and that's our, in a person in the street sort of sense of thing. Our philosophy is, how we approach the world, how we understand it, and so we are looking at those core grand theories that drive our understanding, and that will be true in every area. So there's nothing philosophy in many philosophy departments in Britain and North America is quite heavily focused on either issues of language or of the mind and so forth. And so the sort of sense of philosophy is, in that context, tends to become a rather sort of smaller topic than the one that we have, which is to take any idea which contributes to our overall worldview and think, well, what do we think of this, and what is driving it, and is it one which we want to endorse, or are there cracks in it that need to be explored?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean that would explain also the title. There's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in.
Yeah. Yes, of course. That title is it fits what we're doing very well, in the sense that it actually comes from a Leonard Cohen song, for those people who are into this sort of thing. I actually heard Leonard Cohen at Glastonbury in 2008. He was doing his final, the beginning of his tour, as it were, and I imagined he was going to be a rather sad figure of trying to revive his early songs, and like a couple of 100,000 other people, I was in the crowd, and he was very remarkable. In fact, far from it being rehashed material, it was very impressive, and I heard some of his songs really for the first time, and this one in particular, There Is a Crack in Everything, That's How the Light Gets In. And shortly afterwards, we were just beginning thinking what might we call the festival, and I thought that is very much the core of the idea of what philosophy should be doing. It should be trying to identify where there are weaknesses in our current thinking, and as a result of identifying those weaknesses, see new vistas of how we might hold things differently.
Mm-hmm. And do you think in the process of identifying those cracks and amending those assumptions, changing them, that there's any kind of grander ethical program? Or do you think that will help make us better people? Or is it just to expand our minds in some way? What is possible?
Well,
maybe those two things are connected.
Yes, I mean, ethics is a strange topic. Strange in the sense that it's so often used as a means of justifying our prejudice. So, parents do this with children, don't they? They when the child's asked them umpteen times, well, why do I need to do this? Well, they just say, well, you should do it, or it's right, or it's the good thing to do, or whatever. And so I think that a lot of morality is a defense of prejudice, and of somehow bringing the conversation to an end. So when saying, are we doing this in order to make the world a better place, or sort of be on the side of good? Well, everyone pretends they want to be on the side of good, don't they? That's just the nature of the way the vocabulary is set up. I mean, only in sort of Hollywood science fiction stories do you have people actually against good. So of course we think that what we're doing is for the betterment of people, and we think that this is a positive thing and valuable and so forth. But I would hesitate to use these terms, which I think are usually questionable.
So, for example, if someone said, what's the value of public philosophy, you wouldn't want to put it in terms of ethical terms. And how would you describe the value?
The very reason that putting in ethical terms is not answering the question. It's just saying, well, I like it, and grandifying it with an ethical word like good or morally right or whatever it would be. It's just calling on some other authority to say that what you think is valuable. Well, I think most of that can go in the dustbin, and we're not interested in that sort of prejudice. I think that what we are interested in is exploring how we understand the world and trying to find ways that would enable us to do things that we approve of, and that we think would, in a not moral sense, make the world a better place.
What does that mean, in a not moral sense, make the world a better place?
Well, what does it mean to say in a moral sense? What is this other than to? This is Nietzsche's point about God is dead, isn't it? That for a long time we relied on an external authority in order to give ourselves meaning and an understanding of what we were doing in the world. But gradually our own exploration of the world has uncovered the limitations of that. And so I think I would feel much more comfortable in saying there are practical things that we can do or achieve with our new philosophical frameworks, rather than trying to appeal to some other authority, which is what morality seeks to do. Okay.
So then when you talk about practical things, those practical things are not to achieve it's not what some authority thinks is good, but those practical things presumably improve the situation, the condition for other people, which could be seen as moral, could be seen as something in some basic sense to be good, even that if that was not dictated by some moral code.
Yes, as I say, of course. Everybody thinks that what they're doing is morally good. I just don't like wrapping oneself in the flag.
Okay.
It's not attractive.
Yes. Okay.
It's not attractive. The people who've wrapped their self in the moral flag are usually up to no good, in my view, and indeed have been responsible for terrible things. So we should be a bit wary of it. That's all. A bit wary of it. And I think
tread carefully.
There are other ways of describing. I mean, there are times, I'm sure, when I fall into my own mistake, and say, well, we're trying to improve the body politic. We're trying to create a space where we overcome the prejudices of our time. We are trying to, all of these things, and it's quite hard to get rid of that sort of moral language in defense of one's judgments. But I just hesitate slightly, as if one is achieving something by saying, oh yes, we're trying to do good. Of course we're trying to do good in some fundamental way. Why? Who wouldn't be?
Right. So we can assume that context, but we're not going to lord it around.
Yeah, and maybe there's a bit more going on in that conversation than just assume that context. Because as I say, I think that moral discourse is dangerous, and there's plenty of sign of it returning.
So is it a difference between expressing it to others and thinking it? So, for example, if you communicated, this is our program, this is what we're trying to achieve, is that where you see the main dangers lying in imposing it on other people through language?
I think the main thing that's tricky about moral frameworks, and indeed framework of right and wrong, which spreads a little bit further than morality, is that it takes the complexity of the world and imagines that it is binary. And this is very dangerous, because it makes it look as if all goods are the same and all bads are the same, and you act on those. If you act on those simple categories, as I say, you frequently end up making terrible errors. So I'd just be wary of them. Mm-hmm. And they're also used by people to make themselves feel good psychologically. Oh, I'm good. I'm on the side of good. Pat myself on the back. Show off to other people, I'm good. I don't like any of it.
Right. So, but also presumably you wouldn't want people to think I'm bad either. So they would need to move beyond these categories of good and bad, that binary, in order to live better.
In favor of hopefully a more sophisticated sense of what one is trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. And whether people approve of that or not, that'll be based on all sorts of complex judgments there. But of course, almost everyone is a mode of thinking that they're trying to do something that they think they approve of. I mean, why would you try to do something you don't approve of? The whole thing is sort of circular. Mm-hmm. But so really, I think that morality stuff is usually just shoring up power most of the time, trying to say, this is why it's being done. And actually, not only do I approve of it, but it is good. Some other authority is coming to my aid here. I think we need a bit more humility in the world than that.
Mm-hmm. And you think then intellectual humility or humility about the truth will best be achieved by recognizing this complexity. But then on the one hand, you have moral realism, the view that there are these mind-independent moral truths, that there is a fact of the matter about what is good, what is bad. Then you have moral relativism, which says it depends on each individual or each culture or each context. How would you traverse that divide between those two? Or is it possible to do so?
Of course, I'm a long-standing critic of realism. So I'm a long-standing critic of realism in all aspects of reality, material reality, and so forth. So of course, I'm critical of the idea that there are moral facts. I regard the whole thing as being, farcical, farcical and dangerous. And something that, of course, one has to combat. People who believe in moral facts are thoroughly dangerous folk because they're not self-questioning. They imagine that the world divides into these neat categories, which are human categories, and they don't. And it leads to terrible outcomes, like killing people because you think you're doing good for them, or you're saving them from evil, or whatever it would be. I think needs to be combated at some serious level.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, yes, this critique of realism you express in your book on closure. Perhaps you could link that to this talk of moral realism. What would closure theory have to say about moral realism? Why it's wrong?
Well, I started out like I guess many people as a student. I was at Oxford. I remember it well. I was fortunate to be taught by a renowned sociologist called Stephen Lukes, who'd written a book about relativism. And I rather laughably went along at the beginning of the term and said, look, I want to get to the bedrock, the foundation of knowledge. I want to be sure of where I am, but that's what I'm going to do. And he, of course, indulged me. He must have thought it's ridiculous. Indulged me and said, yeah, okay. Well, actually, he had the last laugh because the more I looked for a bedrock, the more I uncovered our inability to find one. I was then faced with, well, if we can't find a basis for what we call knowledge, if we don't have a ground, as it were, what do we do about that? And I puzzled about that for a long time. My early works were about the problem of self-reference. That if you deny truth or you draw attention to perspective, then you can't express your view because that applies to yourself as well. If you say there is no truth, it's presumably not true that there is no truth, as it were. So I was very much engaged with that. But I then saw, well, what could a possible way out of this conundrum be? A conundrum which it seems to me is, bedevils Western culture. It's somehow the Enlightenment has led to a point of the undermining of the solidity of knowledge, as it were. And then the question, well, what do you do about it? And because you can't seem to express the position that takes up. And so closure is about trying to provide a framework to deal with that. And I started with what initially seems to be a completely implausible position, because I didn't, I obviously when I was thinking that, I didn't know that I could make it work at all. I just thought, well, let's imagine that instead of thinking that our thought and our senses are somehow discovering a reality which is out there, which we can uncover, and which there's a correct answer, that we're hunting for the right answer as if it's like a crossword puzzle. If instead of thinking of it like that, if we think, well, actually the world is something other than us. It's not that it's not there, but it's something other than us, and it's not divided into the sorts of things that we might discover. It's somehow different, but in a way that is not definable, because if it was definable, then we could say how it was different. And in a way of trying to, I toyed with, Heidegger has the issue of crossing through beings to identify that you can't actually refer to being, that it's crossed out, because otherwise it looks as if it's referring to something. I toyed with the idea of having something like world crossed out, as it were, as what this was. But I thought, well, that's a bit of a cop-out. Instead, I went for the word openness and said, well, let's imagine the world as being open. It doesn't have any differentiation to it that's already divided. And what we are trying to do is make sense of this stuff that is other. And the framework of closure is one which demonstrates, I think, that you do not need to think that our senses and our thought are describing a reality in order for it to be effective and useful for us to intervene. And once that is developed, there is then an account, there's then a framework to escape this problem of self-reference, because the theory itself can account for why it works. One of the examples that I give is that, when you look up at the stars, you see all sorts of patterns. You can see Orion, astronomers can see Hercules or whatever it would be. But we don't think those patterns are really there, do we? I mean, if we were at a different place in the universe, the patterns would look different. And what's more, there is an indefinite number of patterns that we can hold the stars in. In fact, even in just 100 stars, you can create more patterns than there are atoms in the known universe. So, in a spectacular number of ways you can pattern those stars. You can basically find anything in the patterns. So we don't think that any one of those patterns is true, and it's not in some sense related to reality, because there's an almost infinite number that could be applied. It doesn't mean to say they're not useful. Mm-hmm. Once you've identified a pattern, you can just point to the star that's just to the right at the top. You say, see, Orion, well, you see that star that's just above the one on the top left-hand side? So you can use it to point to something else. You can track that pattern across the sky. If you fill out the whole sky, which people did in the medieval period before there were compasses, you can use it to navigate around the world. It's immensely powerful. But nobody thinks that it's true. And it's not uncovering a reality. It's not somehow, well, it's uncovering, Orion is uncovering something ultimate out there. That's not what's going on. It's holding this stuff, which is other than us, as something. So we hold it as Orion. It's not that it is Orion, we hold it as Orion. And so the basics of the idea of closure is that our senses and our thought are not descriptions of the world, they are ways of holding the world. And the detail of closure is how it is that those ways of holding the world enable us to achieve all sorts of things. And the structure of how that works, and the structure of constraint that follows from it as well, of course.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that overview, Hilary. Just focusing on this idea of self-reference here, and also you're sort of talking about usefulness more than truth. If we think about the problem of self-reference, presumably you would say you don't want to say that the theory of closure is true, because then that would get into the problem of it reflecting some ultimate reality. But you do want to say that the theory of closure is useful, which is accommodated within the system. Is that right?
Well, it's a little bit more, a little bit different from that. So that the framework of closure traditionally within 20th century Western philosophy, our understanding has largely been driven by words like language and the world. There has also been subject and object, which sort of preceded it to some degree, and was then incorporated into language and world in part, although there were periods where those people who are in favor of language sort of tried to get rid of the subject at one point. But nevertheless, we've operated with those words, language and the world. And the dynamic of those words, the way that they operate, is very difficult to escape this self-referential problem. Something that later Wittgenstein, identified. The end of the Tractatus concludes that language is not able to provide a description of its relationship to the world. That's because it would somehow have to catch sight of itself, and it can't do that. And so he abandons the very idea of ever trying to make any overall story about what's going on, because he's concluded you can't do it. Well, that's sort of related to this self-referential problem, that as soon as you try to stand in that language world story, you tend to get linked into this self-reference issue, which I don't think has ever been overcome. And the reason that I chose closure and openness is the way those two words function is a bit different. So the relationship between closure and openness is not the same as the relationship between language and the world. And what we understand by truth and reality is all rather different in this different framework. So when you say, would I say that closure is useful? Well, I would say the framework of closure enables you to realize a way of holding the world, which I think is powerful and enables us to overcome many of the problems we have at the moment. You might translate that out into a more pragmatist language of saying, actually, closure is useful. Mm. And sometimes I would do that. But I hesitate slightly to do it in quite the way that you were describing, because I want, in a way, to escape what seems to me some of the puzzles that are endemic to the truth reality language, which is the common one in which we inhabit. And the way to do that, I think, is partly to change the vocabulary, and it drops out rather differently.
Right, and usefulness also drops out?
Well, within the framework of closure, I think that our closures are ways of holding the world. That's the phrasing I use.
Yeah.
And I think that they realize material. That is, they realize things. So when we close the world, when we see Orion, we have something we didn't have before. It's not as if it's there in the first place. Through closure, we have something in addition.
Okay.
It's not like we've just identified a pattern that's there. We actually create that pattern in some sense. There is constraint to what we can create, but we realize that pattern, and we hold the world as if it was like that. We hold the world as if Orion is there, even though it self-evidently isn't. So that process of realizing things, which goes on in at least linguistic closure, of realizing things, is the way that we are then able to intervene.
And then that intervening, losing some of the language of usefulness, or taking away some of the language of useful, and talking about practicality, but not necessarily about the consequence.
Well,
is that right?
Well, yes. So I would say you intervene in openness,
right.
And the puzzle is how we can intervene.
Yeah.
And of course, there are then a whole load of other bigger puzzles about the way that we try to manipulate that intervention, and the way that our theories function and are used to change what we can do. And in some broader sense, that's tied up with the political function of theories. That is, the extent to which they are able to influence others, and how we try and influence others, how we try and get, as it were, our closures adopted by other people. None of which is to say that your overall point that you were making at the beginning, that would I want to say closure is true. You're right in one sense, that I obviously don't want to say closure is true in a realist sense. Mm-hmm. But I do want to say that I think it's the most effective story that we have of the world at the moment, which is quite enough. It's already a bit of a grand claim. But I wouldn't want to say that it's true in the sense that it is the one way of holding the world.
Yes, because then you fall into the of reference. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and And of course, in practice, nobody has come up with a story which is true in that sense, which everyone then holds to be the case. But nevertheless, you're right about that.
Right. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to come to a close now. I still have many more questions. We could continue going on this route for quite some time, I imagine. But yeah, good to have a sense of where you're coming from, and also the broader philosophical picture behind the festival.
I think just as a final thought, I think that one of the strange puzzles about the issue of truth and reality and where we are currently in society is, it does seem to me that the Enlightenment has, in the last 100 years, somehow undermined itself. That it had this idea of gradually uncovering the truth about the world, and we have somehow uncovered our inability to do so. And that puzzle, I think, it's an intellectual puzzle in one sense, but it's also become a broader, puzzle for the story of the West in a wider sense, in a political sense. And that played out, I guess, in the form of postmodernism and the growth of postmodernism in the late 20th century. And it has played out most recently in public life in arguments about truth in public discourse and alternative truths and so forth. And so I think these questions of our relation to reality are not little sort of technical, interesting philosophical puzzles. I think that they are absolutely central to our understanding of both ourselves and our place in the world. And I think, I do think, we have to get to grips with it. In the early part of the 20th century in Britain and North America, there was very much a focus on the puzzle, as we were saying, of the relationship between language and the world, and people were really engaged in trying to build a story, if you like, a metaphysics of how that worked and so forth. And what's happened, I think, more recently is the difficulty of doing that and getting success, as it were, has sort of gradually led to it being sidelined as just being too difficult, where we can't work this out, so we'll just get by. We'll just carry on as if the whole problem isn't there. And I don't think that is a viable thing to do. And indeed, at the moment, I think that culturally we're making exactly the wrong move. So I've argued and argue that we have to give up the idea of there being a reality that we're uncovering, or that we can arrive at truth. But I don't think that we give up the tools that we have to improve our models and stories and what I would describe as closures by which we realize the world that we live in. And those tools are the good Enlightenment principles of empiricism and rationality. And both empiricism and rationality, I think, have had a pretty bad press over the last 50 years of postmodernism, as it were. And there are many people who are, skeptical of both, would see it as being Western, colonial, male, white, and so forth. And yet, those very same people are often attached to the idea of there being a truth, their truth. So they're attached to the idea of truth, but they abandon the techniques of the Enlightenment, of empiricism and rationalism, or challenge them. And I think that's just the wrong way around. I would argue that we have to double down on empiricism and rationalism. That is, looking to see whether one's closure, looking to see whether one's theory of the world works, seeing where it doesn't, trying to refine it and so forth, identifying where indeed there are errors and thinking about how one might create stronger and better accounts of the world. And rationalism is part of that as well, following through the consequences of a system of thought in one area and seeing how it applies elsewhere. Those are essential tools. But we just have to give up the idea that they are going somewhere, that they arrive at a sort of, they are uncovering an ultimate reality. And in a way, that's that's one way of understanding what closure is trying to do, and why I think, philosophy is essential, because we have to address this crisis of the West, because it is indeed undermining the West. There are lots of things about Western culture which are very, very valuable and have proved beneficial for many people. It doesn't mean to say everything is beneficial. Of course, lots of things aren't, but nevertheless, there are many things that were very valuable. And there are alternative accounts in the world now which don't apply those principles in quite the same way. And we have to have a basis, standing in the tradition of we have to have an understanding of where we are going with this. And there is a risk that the errors I think we are making in terms of our understanding of this relationship to reality is vitiating the whole of our culture at some level. And we're not, I think, going to solve that until we've got an overall story which works.
Right. And so in the end, it is about effectively addressing some sort of problem, but you'll probably want to shy away from the ethical vocabulary there, but it is some kind of an improvement of some kind if we follow this.
Yeah, certainly I think it's about improving the situation we have at the moment, which is a crisis. Mm-hmm. Crisis of understanding, a crisis of what we think. These are not trivial. They're not just academic. They bite, and as we've seen in the politics of the last decade, they're biting more and more, and they're not hiding from the theoretical problem. Is not going to overcome it. So I think I'm sure there are plenty of other people who will have alternative frameworks and stories to the one that I'm putting forward. But I think we have to have some frameworks to help us overcome the situation we've got and give us a sense of how we can improve and intervene in the world more effectively to achieve the things that we'd like to achieve.
Yeah. Great. Well, yes, thank you very much.